I'd like to take a minute to just talk about the role of great beauties in Chinese history, and to a certain extent, East Asian history in general. Now, when I say great beauties, I'm talking about individuals whose external appearance played a major role in their prestige and in their effectiveness in their various operations, but there's more going on. In ancient China, your external appearance was kind of an indicator of your interior state. Right? So the idea of don't judge a book by its cover didn't really exist. If your outside was attractive, particularly when it came to women, that was a sign of a greater interior disposition. Right? So the more educated you were, the more kind you were, the more virtuous you were, the more likely you were to be physically attractive, or at least to wear that virtue outwardly. For example, great emperors, men of virtue, it was thought that by exhibiting great virtue, these men had longer earlobes than they would otherwise, right? And in fact, if you look at portraits and statues of Liu Bei, who I mentioned in the previous video, you'll often note that his earlobes are exceptionally long, right? Well, it was especially true of women. Their outward appearance is a sign of bravery, of morality, of great intellect. So in many eras in Chinese history, great beauties played a particularly influential role in shaping historical events. There are four beauties who are heralded as being a cut above the rest. Those are the four classic beauties. There's Shishir, who you see in the beginning here in this picture here in the blue, and she was a great spy for the kingdom of Yue in southeastern China, which in traditional Chinese culture, in general, the south was seen as the region that had the most attractive, most refined women, in part due to their what was perceived as their color, and also their hair, their other traits. The second woman here with the musical instrument, the zither, is Wang Jiajun, and she was one of the women who participated in the Haqin system. She was married to a Xiongnu chief, whom she then taught the features of traditional classical culture, Chinese culture, writing, music, morality. So, in other words, she civilized a tribe that was hostile to the Han population, and by doing so, she made an enemy into an ally. So she was very influential in helping her nation in that regard. The third individual is Yang Guifei. She was a very influential concubine, considered very beautiful in the Dong dynasty, and the emperor that she served, Dong Daizu, was one of the greats in his youth. He fell in love with her in his old age, and she is credited with bringing the downfall of the Dong dynasty by putting her favorites in positions of power and essentially controlling the emperor. The fourth figure is Diao, and that's who we're going to talk about today. She was credited with saving the Han dynasty, with preventing the fall of the Han dynasty by about 20 years. Actually more like 30 years. She ended up creating a rift between two traitorous generals, causing them to fight one another instead of overthrowing the emperor. So we're going to talk about Diao tonight, and we're going to look at kind of the virtues that she was celebrated for possessing, and we're going to take a look in doing that at maybe get an idea of what gender norms were supposed to be in ancient China. And this is our last video on the Han dynasty. I know we've had multiple ones, but it's absolutely essential in the formation of this part of the world. Now, I'd like to point out that we don't really know the truth of this, right? How historically accurate these events were, but we do know that they captivated the minds of people as early as 100 years after this period, after the events are alleged to have occurred. And they remained a staple of Chinese culture up until the present day. So basically we have a love story, a love triangle between three individuals. A great general, Lu Bu, who is kind of the mightiest general in all of China, the most fearsome warrior and fighter. And we have the great warlord who was extraordinarily cruel, Dong Zhuo, who was extraordinarily corrupt, had no problem committing atrocities against the people, and Diao Chan, a teenage girl who was supposed to be among the most beautiful women in the world at the time, and was used to drive a wedge between these two men and break up their alliance. We'll start with a little bit of political background. You remember the Yellow Turban or Yellow Scarves Rebellion? I've mentioned it in the last two videos. This rebellion shook Han China. The warlords were called out to destroy this rebellion. Eunuchs in the capital had plotted a coup, and the very foolish Grand Commandant, He Jin, the brother of Empress He, he ended up calling in a warlord from the frontier named Dong Zhuo, who had been battling the Xiongnu, the barbarian peoples who lived north of the Great Wall. He had been battling them. He called this warlord, Dong Zhuo, into the capital with the idea that he would use his army to calm the unrest so that the capital would be stabilized, there would be no more infighting in the imperial court, and the government would be calmed, and the society would become normalized. The problem is that Dong Zhuo was extraordinarily ambitious, and when he arrived in the capital, he took power. He replaced the young emperor with his younger brother, Emperor Xian. Emperor Shao he replaced with Emperor Xian, and because Emperor Xian was a young boy, he essentially had the run of the capital, and he ruled as a dictator with the idea of eventually replacing the Han dynasty and taking the throne. Well, many of the warlords were absolutely appalled at the idea of this one warlord taking so much power upon himself, especially given the fact that he was having people put to death for arbitrary reasons like his suit being cold or the musician's lyre being out of tune, not to mention the people who spoke out against him replacing the emperor with his younger brother. He had dozens of officials put to death for that. But the warlords began to speak out against him, and one of them, another general who fought the Xiongnu to the north, a general named Ding Yuan, he opposed Dong Zhuo taking absolute power like that. The problem that Dong Zhuo had is that he couldn't get rid of Ding Yuan. He simply couldn't call him out and have him murdered, because Ding Yuan's youngest son was the greatest warrior in the land, Lu Bu, the great general whom everyone feared, not just because of his personal physical prowess, but also his command on the battlefield. So Dong Zhuo's son-in-law, an advisor, an official, Li Ru, decided to hatch a plot to get Lu Bu to replace his warlord and adopted father, Ding Yuan. And what they did is they had a general named Li Su come to Lu Bu and offer him a very famous horse called the Red Hare. This is a horse from the far western regions of the Han Dynasty, from a place called Fergana. It had a bright red coat, and it was extraordinarily fast and extraordinarily strong. And this horse was absolutely breathtaking. And Lu Bu, being a warrior, particularly a cavalry commander fighting the Xiongnu, this horse was extraordinarily valuable to him. So he ends up betraying his adopted father, murdering him, which is the absolute most heinous thing you can do in a Confucian society, killing one of your parents, even adopted parents. In fact, the penalty for doing this throughout the imperial period is something called Ling Chi, or the death by 1,000 cuts, in which basically you're sliced open over and over and over again while you're still alive, and you die a very brutal death. And we'll talk more about that as we move into the Qing period in the 19th century, where that practice becomes used as a tool of control for the state. But Lu Bu kills his adopted father, and then he accepts Dong Zhuo, this hated general, this hated warlord, as his adopted father. Now, Dong Zhuo is especially reviled in Chinese history. Any official who spoke out against him, he had him murdered without hesitation. He would send his troops out to despoil the countryside and rob the peasants. He would have people mutilated and tortured just for his own amusement. And on top of that, he was morbidly obese, and his portrayal throughout Chinese history is kind of almost of like this really and truly malevolent boss hog figure. If you've ever seen kind of the Dukes of Hazzard, that's kind of how he's portrayed, right? Absolutely a force for evil. But he now has Lu Bu, the great warrior, at his side, and he can get away with anything he wants. When the coalition of warlords from outside the country forms under the General Cao Cao and also contains the three brothers whom I mentioned earlier, Liu Bei, Zhang Fei, and Guan Yu, when they make war against Dong Zhuo, they meet at a place called Hulao Gate, and a very cinematic duel happens between Lu Bu and the three brothers. Lu Bu is so powerful, he fights off the three brothers by himself all at one time. That's how skilled of a warrior he is. So Lu Bu faces the three brothers, Zhang Fei with his curved spear called the Cobra Spear, Guan Yu with his large Quan Dao or glaive called the Green Dragon, and Liu Bei with his twin swords called the Swords of Fate. Lu Bu had his own signature weapon, a large halberd called the Crescent Moon Halberd, which had two blades that were shaped like crescent moons on both sides of the spear tip, so he could both thrust and chop his enemies on horseback. Remember that they're fighting with stirrups ahead of everyone else in the world, so they're able to actually balance themselves and use both hands to swing a very powerful polearm while on horseback. Lu Bu was also famous for the two pheasant tail feathers he wore in his headdress. They're kind of his signature in opera, in ancient paintings, right? And these are part of the style that was worn in the region where he had been a commanding general. So the coalition of warlords, which contains the three brothers and is led by Cao Cao, manages to defeat Dong Zhuo's army, but they are not able to completely crush him. He retreats into the capital. He takes the emperor hostage. He burns the capital city of Luoyang, the largest city in the world at the time, and he migrates to the old capital at Chang'an, which was the capital under the Western Han, if you remember that term. He forces thousands of peasants, townspeople, to march with him. Many elderly people, small children, die during the forced march. It's a very, very cruel act. He sets the entire capital ablaze after looting the imperial tombs and treasury. And in the new capital of Chang'an, the terrain is much more defensible, with gates and mountain passes organized in a way to where even with a smaller number of men, he can still control the capital and hold the emperor hostage. And he basically has run of the imperial court. Even though he's been defeated outside of the capital, he's able to brutalize the population within the new capital. This is where the young Diao Chan enters the story. There is a very loyal minister named Wang Yun. He's very advanced in years. He's loyal to the emperor, who has been kidnapped by Dong Zhuo and relocated to the new capital. Wang Yun hatches a scheme to destroy Dong Zhuo, to have his famous general Lu Bu, which is his primary source of power, turn against him. And his plan is to make both Dong Zhuo and Lu Bu fall in love with Diao Chan. Diao Chan is exceptional. She's very well educated. She's got an almost genius level of intellect. She can recite the Confucian classics. She can recite poetry. And, of course, she's physically very attractive. And so Wang Yun invites Lu Bu to dinner. And he says, I want my serving girl, my adopted daughter, to dance for you. And she dances for him, and he becomes mesmerized by her. And he says, I have to have this woman join my household. How much do I have to pay you? What do I have to do? And Wang Yun says, you don't have to give me anything. I'm just happy that that she will find a match in a general of your renown. Let me wait a few days to prepare, and I will send her to your estate." So Lu Bu leaves the dinner party that Wang Yun had invited him to, and where Diao Chan had danced for the general. He leaves it elated, full of joy, because this beautiful young woman is going to be joining his household. The next night, he invites Dung Zhuo to his household and has a private banquet just for him. And again, he brings out his adopted daughter, Diao Chan, to dance. This time, she dances for the former general, now Prime Minister, Dung Zhuo, who wants to replace the emperor and become emperor himself. And Dung Zhuo, just like his adopted son and general, Lu Bu, is smitten with this young woman, and he says, "I have to have her join my household." And Wang Yun says, "It would be an honor. Give me a couple of days, and I will send her to the palace to live with you." And Dung Zhuo leaves his Wang Yun's household very happy. When Wang Yun finally sends Diao Chan to Dung Zhuo to the court, Lu Bu enters Wang Yun's house enraged. "You promised me her hand, yet you've given her to him. What's going on here?" And Wang Yun lies to Lu Bu, and he says, "Well, I was going to give her to you as I had promised. But when Lord Dung Zhuo saw her, he said that he had to have her, and that she had to go to the palace to serve him immediately. And I had no choice but to accept. I told him that I had promised her to you, but he said he didn't care about that. He just wanted her all to himself, and he didn't care what you thought." And so Lu Bu naturally becomes even more enraged. "I've been betrayed by him. I'm gonna teach him." And Diao Chan, for her part, who is a willing participant in this ruse, she ends up actually, when she sees Lu Bu later on, she reaches out to him, and there's a very, very famous scene at a bridge in Chang'an. And this motif is popular throughout Chinese art and literature from the 3rd century into the present. Lu Bu sees her, and he says, "How could you do this to me? You were supposed to come to my house." And she throws herself in Lu Bu's arms, and she said, "Oh, that brute took me against my will. He's going to kill me. I know it. I need you to save me." And Lu Bu becomes absolutely enraged because he's in love with this young woman. And, well, he ends up joining a plot to kill his master, Dung Zhuo. Lu Bu works with the minister, Wang Yun, Diao Chan's adopted father, and they craft a plot to make Dung Zhuo think he's about to be crowned emperor. When he goes into the palace to be crowned emperor, Lu Bu comes out and stabs him to death. They burn his corpse in public. They leave it on display, and apparently, according to Chen Shou, the primary source from this period of time, they set him on fire, and because of his great corpulence, the fat on his body burns for a considerable length of time, a very long period. So Diao Chan ends up joining Lu Bu. She was in on this plot. She was part of this scheme, but according to the traditional Chinese arts, she actually did fall for Lu Bu. He was very athletic, very handsome. He was young like she was. He wasn't as young as her, but he was still relatively young, unlike Dung Zhuo. And so they continued as a couple after this. When Lu Bu is ultimately driven out of the capital, he takes Diao Chan with him. She ends up accompanying him as he rampages across eastern China. He battles the three sworn brothers mentioned earlier, and he's ultimately captured and executed by Cao Cao, who then takes Diao Chan into his harem, where she eventually will grow old and pass away. I wanted to include this because it's an example of service to the state. Right? This very famous beauty isn't using her beauty to enrich herself or to gain status. She's sacrificing her life out of loyalty to the empire. And it's for this that she's included in the ranks of the four classic beauties and has been celebrated in Chinese art and literature ever since. So, even though we don't know the historical veracity of all the elements of this story, culturally it's very important. So, from an anthropological point of view, it's essential in understanding Chinese and therefore East Asian culture. This was an individual who was swept up in events much greater than herself, who nevertheless sacrificed her own life for the betterment of society, which is part of the collectivist spirit that I alluded to at the beginning of the course. So, and it tells us a lot about the roles of women. She was expected to be beautiful, educated, and the ancient Chinese did, in fact, educate girls very rigorously, in fact. But despite this, she was required to be completely submissive to her adopted father and then to the men who controlled her later on. So we can get an idea of the expectations of women in this society by looking at what this idealized version, this idealized version of femininity, what was required of her, right? Uh, and not just that, the people in general were required to give their lives for the greater good of society and for the state. And this story really exemplifies that in a romantic way. And I thought that might be more interesting than some other content that kind of proves this point.